Yeah, thanks for sticking around, and I imagine this is probably outside of a lot of people's field, as a lot of your presentations were outside of mine. So what I've done is basically to track trends in animals in literature over the last roughly 100 years, and to look at a particular way of reading very contemporary writing that imaginative writing that involves animals. The main idea being that the overwhelming presence of 21st century texts featuring animals is reconfiguring and also reflecting reconfigurations of changes in interspecies relationships. So one more thing that I'm hoping to do here is also suggest ways that literature might matter and make a difference. I think for several hundred years we've been following this dictum a little bit too closely. Some of you may recognize the oft-quoted Alexander Pope. And so this cartoon offers a slightly different perspective, and maybe one that might help us answer some of the questions about problems in the world that the first one is not doing so well answering. Seems to me, in getting into this field, that many disciplines, including the discipline of literature, have lagged behind a lot of regular people's understanding of animals. And so some possible reasons for that: we have the taboo of anthropomorphism, which seems to occur just about everywhere. In literature, one way it occurs is through something we call the pathetic fallacy, which is a great sin, attributing human faculties to animals. Other human qualities, including the supposedly exclusive possession of reason, and the philosophical tradition, which I mentioned at the beginning and which I'm going to get into a little bit more right now. Many of you are familiar with the idea that we separate man or humanity from all the other species, the animal, using basically any reason you want to give, whether it be language, art, the ability to reason, emotions, you name it, basically attributing to man, therefore to ourselves, what we refuse the animal, and that's problematic, attributing it to ourselves. So what's going on in fiction? In the modern period, which is roughly the first half of the 20th century, so basically my time periods I'm going to separate here: the first half of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, and where we are now in the 21st century. In the first half of the 20th century, you find a lot of heavyweights in fiction. Obviously, I've had to leave a lot of people out, and I'd be glad to hear some of the names you would put up there, but you know, you might, certainly there's lots of people we could add, but some names you're probably familiar with: Jack London, Mark Twain, Kafka, Faulkner, Melville. You might want to put Kipling in there, Orwell, Hemingway. Unfortunately, not a lot of women. Sorry about that. That's another discussion. In the second half of the 20th century, we seem to go kind of silent around animals. So if you can think of a major second half of the 20th century text featuring animals, you know, maybe Watership Down, but it's hard to really come up with a list of significant fiction in the second half of the 20th century. In poetry, however, it seems to me that we've always been interested in animals. These are some poets who feature animals, and basically they represent just about every decade over the last 100 plus years. Problem is, nobody reads it. So the reading of poetry in the US is down to about 8% of adults. So we're back to hoping that fiction might be able to reach people. And in fact, it has been reaching people. Some reasons why, and these are, you know, not exhaustive at all, but some reasons that come to mind right away for these trends. The typical way of understanding bookends of modern literature is to look at, you know, maybe Darwin's work, maybe World War I as a starting point, and then World War II as the other end. So after World War II and sort of a loss of faith in human nature and in the march of progress in exploiting animals in that march of progress, no longer an attempt, as T.S. Eliot would say, to shore these fragments against our ruin. Maybe that helped us to lose our interest in looking at human and other animal or other critter relationships. Then, of course, the novel died, at least according to Norman Mailer. You may have your favorite novelists of the second half of the 20th century, but maybe in that time period, we really haven't been capable of crafting the kind of significant fiction that went on in the first half of the 20th century. That's my bias, anyway. Jacques Derrida, you may be familiar with, points out that the literature of the modernist period is a critique of itself. And that may be a reason why modern literature has been able to deal with human-animal relationships in a creative way, in a transformative way. So towards the end, I'm going to look at this idea of performativity as it works in contemporary texts and how they may be challenging our notions of species in a very different way from how the word performativity was used in Diane's presentation. And then finally, I'm not going to have a lot of time to get into this, but I would venture that poetry is just generally a better genre for doing that kind of work than fiction, or at least it has been, in the way that in the way particularly that it's performative, that it is transformative, that it maybe speaks to us on a deeper level. So to give you an idea of sort of the quantitative trends in literature involving animals over the last roughly century, I use the MLA database, which is the leading database in my field, looking for references for animal and literature, animal and fiction, and then animal and poetry. And you'll see for most of the century, you'll see that animal and poetry kind of stays the same or outnumbers animal and fiction. Oops, we missed a slide. Oh, it's not there. Sorry about that. But then what happens in roughly, so basically you have the red line for most of the 20th century slightly above the blue line, and then what happens in the 21st century is the blue line goes up like that. So something's definitely going on in animal fiction. You may have noticed it, particularly dogs. At one point, I searched Amazon for dogs in titles of book releases, and I think there were 2,600 in 90 days. So there is this real boom, and particularly in memoir. Here's some examples which would make a really good summer reading list for those of you whose summer reading list is not full. And just for fun, in purple, I put those in which animals speak, which I think may have some power as well. So basically, you can question how do these come on this list and not others. I picked them, because they are generally bestsellers or award winners or both. And most of them are, within the 21st century, and they're in chronological order. These look familiar to people? Okay, and some more. So here's the memoir section from 1995 to current, all of these memoirs. Some mysteries. You may be familiar with Adrian Franklin's work, which can give us a socio-historical perspective on why human-animal relations may be being reflected differently and more in contemporary lit. Not necessarily in this order, but with postmodernity, used slightly differently here from how it's used in literature, but misanthropy, risk, and ontological insecurity being more shared now than before, with the distinction between human and other species no longer necessarily assumed, and because we're in closer contact with more animals and more kinds of animals. And some philosophical and literary ways we can understand the change. Derrida, who reverses the zoological gaze, Foucault's understanding of power, Donna Haraway, whom you may be familiar with, a few people have cited her here, started out with cyborg feminism and has more recently moved into human animal studies and the idea of becoming with. So the idea that we don't pre-exist a meeting with another species, that we establish our own identity in our relationship with other species. And you can say the same thing about language, that our identities don't pre-exist our language constructions of them. Butler and Sedgwick are probably the best, I think, theoretical way of understanding current texts. They take speech act theory and usually apply it to gender, although some of it has been being applied to other political contexts as well. What I'm going to do in a moment is take their understanding of the body, sex, and gender, and just sort of playfully substitute species in there and see what happens, using their idea of performativity. So I've plugged species in here. The category of species is, from the start, normative. It is what Foucault has called a regulatory ideal. Species not only functions as a norm, but is part of a regulatory practice that produces the bodies it governs. Performativity must be understood as the reiterative and citational practice by which discourse produces the effects that it names. The regulatory norms of species work in a performative fashion to constitute the materiality of critters, to constitute us, and more specifically, to materialize the critter's species, to create our species, to materialize species difference in the service of consolidation of human hegemony. So that's not what they do with it. They use it for gender, and I'm using it for species. And I'm going to give you some examples of how that works in contemporary texts. Oh, this is not the one that I uploaded, but that's okay. We'll skip over Lord of Misrule, which is definitely worth a read, and go right to The Life of Pi, because I think people are more familiar with it. But think of performativity as a linguistic act that actually transforms reality, doesn't just mime it or describe it, but critiques it. Sort of like drag critiques gender. It takes it on and does it, but maybe apes it, so it's doing it in a different way. And so in Life of Pi, you have the rhetorical question that Richard Parker asks. Richard Parker, the tiger, asks the little boy Pi when he says, and what species, and what are you? In other words, Pi calls him an animal, a terrible animal, and he says, and what are you? So that question bounces back. It's a very theatrical question. You also have the different possible endings in the Life of Pi, so that the relationship between fiction, between the stories we tell ourselves and reality is questioned. Which is more real? Which would we prefer? The story, or what's more plausible, or what really happened? Ishmael, An Adventure of the Mind and Spirit, a little bit older. There is the sort of unanswerable question, with man gone, will there be hope for gorilla? And that question, it appears on the cover of some of the versions. It appears at the end of all of them. It appears in different contexts, so it keeps changing. And our understanding of what it means keeps changing. And in fact, the position of gorilla and man change as the text moves on. So really making us wonder, who's going to protect whom or doom whom The Art of Racing in the Rain, one of the humans says about Enzo, who's the dog narrator, says, "What a dumb animal." And that ironically bounces back on the human. And we see that the really dumb animal is the human. Some of you may be familiar, this is a little bit heavier, but some of you may be familiar with Thomas Edison's experiments when he did public electrocutions of animals to disprove his competitor. There's a recent book of stories, Love and Infant Monkeys, which was nominated for a Pulitzer. And it takes real life encounters between celebrities and animals and elaborates upon them. And in this story, a videotape that Edison has of this very famous elephant Topsy being electrocuted publicly, he watches it over and over and kind of gets off on it and talks to the elephant. And then by the end, the elephant is actually talking to him and haunting him and basically telling him how he's going to save himself and save his soul. So the elephant becomes the author and the speaker and the subject. What does all of this mean? Well, we've seen that animals are back full force in fiction, that the large numbers of people reading this fiction create an opportunity, a performative opportunity for real transformation in public consciousness. It's reconfiguring our notions of what species is and our relationships among each other using things like irony, satire, parody, rhetorical questions, different performative devices. They really can make a difference, and the animals are speaking and telling us, if we listen, how there might be hope for us and how to save ourselves. Thanks.